top 2 teams lost this week, which means there's been a bit of a shake-up in the top 8 and the top 4. Well, not quite yet in the top 4, but it will be. Swans and the Blues both lost, as I said. The Swans for the second week in a row, meaning the race for those positions, I guess, probably isn't yet done. Blues are now only a couple of points ahead of Freo and Essendon. There's teams coming from outside the 8. The Lions are now back in the hunt. The Dogs are thereabouts. Port's still going. There's a lot of moving parts. Firstly, I think we want to start with the Swans in this discussion because it's now 2 weeks in a row that they've lost. 3 losses for the season. We talked last week on the blueprint on how to beat them. Now, were the Saints able to do that this week? And that's punish turnover, work methodically with the ball, take uncontested marks. Is that how they were able to do it?
It was, and a little bit of luck sprinkled in. So all the teams that have beaten Sydney have... Richmond in round 3, the expected score was 82 all. So that should have been a draw and Richmond won.
Wow.
Freo should have won on expected scores by about 14 points, and Sydney should have beaten... Sydney should have beaten Freo by 14 points the week before, and they should have also beaten St Kilda by 12 points.
So they should
you
be
do need a little bit of luck, but in saying all that, there is the other way that you look at the stats that all these teams are sort of produced against Sydney, and there's the common theme of St Kilda only beat them by 1 point from turnover. So just the measly point, but it's only the 3rd time Sydney's been outscored from turnover this year, and they've lost all 3 of those games. Outscored Freo from clearances and Richmond from clearances. I think St Kilda just got them from clearances slightly as well. But yeah, that doesn't really matter how you go again in the clearance sort of game against Sydney. They can lose that and still beat you. It's the turnover game that they've lost. But yeah, just the methodical ball use. So we talk about Sydney, high chaos, high turnover team, and really, really good at punishing turnovers. So they almost bait you into playing the same way they do. They got high octane, Goulden, Warner, Heaney coming through the midfield. That's sort of the way they play. They want you to sort of go the same way when you get the ball, helter-skelter, and it's stacked up well from earlier this year. The Saints were able to sort of slow the game down, took 126 marks across the game, the most against Sydney this year. The second most against Sydney, 110 by the Tigers when they beat them in round 3. The third most against Sydney was 105 taken by the Dockers.
The first time you can look at it and say, well, Richmond, you're not really putting too much basis towards this and saying this is how to do it. The second time when Freo does it, you go, maybe there's a little bit of a pattern emerging here. A third time, and it's a trend.
Yeah, and it shows you that, as I said, there's going to be luck and everything else, but all you got to do is give yourself a chance, which is what these 3 teams... To give yourself a chance against Sydney, you don't want to get into a high chaos, high turnover team. Interestingly, the only game that Sydney should have lost this year on expected scores was in round 11 versus the Bulldogs. That's the 4th most marks taken against Sydney in a game this year. So Bulldogs also did it and almost pinched the points on that night as well. So high control, get them from turnover.
I think I tipped the Bulldogs that
but
day
yes,
as well.
You probably also have to cross your fingers a little bit to make sure you get that expected accuracy.
So does something drastic need to change?
From Sydney?
Because I don't think so.
No,
but
I'm with you. I think it's... 120 marks is not going to be taken in a finals game. You're not going to see a team play like that in finals usually. It's the chaos game. So that's what, you might be able to keep yourself in with a chance with Sydney for the rest of the home and away rounds.
Yeah.
When it becomes finals and the pressure and the heat of finals comes along, it's going to become more of a turnover game, which we know Geelong won the premiership 2 years ago based on it. Collingwood did it last year, and Sydney are already the best at it this year. So
the timing is quite interesting with these 2 losses because there are 2 very key players that are sort of just looming and lurking on the sideline. So Callum Mills, obviously we expect him to come back in. But what about Luke Parker?
He wasn't in the side before he got suspended.
Exactly, but now he got suspended. I believe the suspension's over now, right?
I think
it's over. I think last week was the...
Charlie Dixon's also free to play this week.
Yeah. So does he come back in? Given that they've lost a couple of games, do they think we might shake things up a touch? Or, as you say, he hasn't played at all this year. They haven't needed him to this point.
It's a good
question. Do they ride with what they've got?
In that game, they were up by 5 goals in the third quarter.
Yeah.
So it's not like they were struggling the whole way.
I don't think you can overreact. All 3 losses what have they lost by? 1 point, 2 point, and 2 points, and 5 or 4 or something. Yeah. So it's not like they've been beaten badly in any game this year. I'm kind of the camp of you ride with what you're doing because it's working well. And as you said, they have won all their games, and the ones that they've lost, they probably should have won on expected scores or drawn. So I'd be sticking fat with what you've got.
So Mills comes in.
Mills comes in for sure, but I don't know.
Where are you playing him?
I think I'd be starting him at half back.
Yeah. Ease him into the season.
I think the midfield's working well. Not to say the back line isn't, but I think you can bring him back in there and then you can sprinkle him into the midfield as needed. But I wouldn't mess with the midfield mix at the moment. I think that's working really well.
Fair enough. Hey, the Dockers that sit third as we speak, they're on record pace in terms of their clearances. They're a clearance machine, and it seems like a style, though, Christian, that hasn't really been a hallmark of recent premiers. So it's kind of interesting to see a team doing so well, but bucking a trend that we've sort of talked about in terms of like turnover game and scoring from other sources.
Yep, so they've dropped this round. They've now got the 5th best clearance differential at this stage of the season, which is a fair big drop from where they were number 1 last week. I think they're plus 127. The best team is Carlton earlier in the millennium, who had 137 at this stage. So I think they must have had a big round 17 game, which has overtaken Freo. But Freo for the last 6 or 7 weeks have continually been one of the best clearance differentials at that stage of the season we've ever had. So, but yeah, you talk about, clearance and winning premierships on the premiership standard. Only 3 of the past 10 premiers have ranked top 6 for clearances. So Richmond...
So it's almost... Sitting back,
it's almost like you don't it's almost at the other end, but again, a lot of that is to do with Richmond and Hawthorn were probably very low clearance winning teams, whereas Melbourne sort of highly relied on that. Had Brisbane won it last year, they were the number 1 clearance team, so it would have sort of pumped the stat up. So
that's the thing. So you're relying on, like, we go back to that kneel free and stuff. It's like that can change these stats drastically.
But one of the things, it's not the be-all and end-all. Winning a clearance isn't going to get you much, but I think for Fremantle, winning the clearance does is it means you have the ball more. So it's going to help your defence. It's going to help your territory because it's going to help you get it forward more. We found that there's a good correlation between winning clearances and having high uncontested possessions because if you can take it out of the stoppage first, you're probably going to get the first use for it. So even though, the number 1 stat that they're in this year doesn't sort of stack up to be the most important stat for winning premierships, but it's the stuff around it. I mean, they're still second for points against, and they're sort of top 6 in both scores per inside 54 and scores per inside 50 against. There's only 2 other teams, which is Sydney and Collingwood, that are in top 6 of both stats. So one is on their way to winning a premiership, we think. One's just come off winning a premiership. And Freo's the other one that have got balance at both ends of the field. And as I said, with the clearance stuff, it's their signature. It's how they get Sarong, Fife, Hayden Young, Brayshaw into the game. But then what they've been able to do with that, once the sort of game has sort of gone out of the clearance into the general play stuff, their bookend stuff is sort of holding up really, really well. I sort of look at them, and they might not be the most exciting team as Sydney, but comparing them to Sydney, Carlton, Essendon, and the teams around it, they are the most balanced team of those 5, I feel anyway.
So where do you put them in terms of if you were ranking the likelihood of every team winning it this year, where does Freo slot in?
Yeah.
Because I think, despite the last couple of weeks, I think Sydney and Carlton, for most people, probably going to be 1 and 2. Then where? Brisbane's charging. So is it
one thing I've big and
I know you're
no number to support this, but I've always been big on once finals comes around, you need to have lost a final series before you can dominate one. Usually, especially to make it to a grand final. You don't see a lot of teams.
A lot of these teams here,
I know, are in there for the first time, but that's why I'm looking at a Brisbane, a Collingwood sneak in there. Sydney have just been there 2 years ago. Carlton and GWS were both in prelims last year. So for Freo, if they can get to 2nd or 3rd week of finals, that has to be a tick for them. You'd have to say they're in the top 5 at the moment for most likely to win it, based on form and numbers. But I just think where they're at, it's just make some finals, win a final, and then go hard next year.
I think the problem is 4th and 5th most likely is not that, in my mind at least, is not that far ahead of the 7th and 8th most likely. And I think that's where it is a bit cliche, but you can throw a blanket over 6 teams in terms of their likelihood of winning it this year.
Well, one of the teams we didn't mention in that little bit just then was the Dons, and they sit 4th. So they're the same number of points as Freo, obviously both having had a draw, but their percentage still sits below 100.
It doesn't make sense.
I look at crowds and find interest in that. I also find interest in percentage, and having a percentage under 100, but being in the top 4 at this stage of the year doesn't compute, and it kind of doesn't with the stats either. Yeah,
so no team's obviously ever finished, especially in the 16 or 18 team competition, with a percentage below 100 and finished top 4. The latest a team's been in there was round 18, 2000. Geelong was in the top 4 with a percentage under 100. So not sure if they made finals that year or not by the end of it, but it's just a quirky stat where we say percentage is a great indicator of whether you've won the season or not, but Yeah,
sometimes you get these sort of weird.
With Essendon, we've gone up and down with them. They've got the great sort of profile, but they couldn't beat the good teams, and now they've beaten the good teams. But I've sort of got some stats on the expected scores ladder, which we'll go through later, which might show they've been a little bit lucky.
So if they finish the season in 5th or 6th and their percentage is 99 and they go on and win the flag, have they won the season?
Oh, definitely, 100%.
Conversely, though, the Crows are bottom 4, and their percentage is 102.6, which also sort of piqued my interest.
Yeah, that's crazy as well. That's even more bizarre.
Yeah, so they were in the bottom 4 at round 14 with 107.1%. So that's the highest since 99 onwards. Sort of that late in the season with that high percentage. But yeah, there's been 16 rounds since 99 where a team in the bottom 4 has had a percentage over 100 at sort of this late in the year. And it's 4 of them have been Adelaide this year. So it's the last 4 rounds. Every time you look at Adelaide, at round 16 they have a percentage of this. At round 15 they have a percentage of this. So they've been doing it for quite a while. Most recent time it's been a percentage this high, this late was Sydney at round 11, 2017. We're in the bottom 4 with a percentage.
So we're 7 weeks beyond that now.
Yeah, exactly. So it's both of them. Essendon and Adelaide are very unheard of in terms of where they're
Strange year all round.
Been a weird one. What about the reigning premiers, just before we move on? They've sort of dropped off massively. You talk about that round 11 mark. From round 11 onwards, they're really sort of struggling to get their hands on the footy. They can't apply pressure as they want. They're losing players here and there as well. So it's not looking good for Collingwood in their premiership defence.
Yeah, a lot of it came to the fore just against Essendon. So gave up 404 disposals against Essendon. But on that night, it was their second lowest pressure under McRae. It was their fewest tackles they've ever had under McRae. And they allowed Essendon to take 139 marks, which is the most they've conceded under McRae. So just being able to get their hands to the ball and pressure the opposition. And I looked at it this year. There's only been one game this year where they've had more disposals and a better disposal efficiency than their opposition.
That's staggering.
Richmond is the only team yet to do it. Collingwood is second last with just one game where they've sort of won both of those stats. Did it 11 times last year up until the grand final, 10 times across the home and rounds, which was the 5th most. But yeah, as you spoke about, since round 11 onwards, they're just simple things. Last for kicking efficiency, they're 5th last for inside 50s per game, so they're not getting the forward momentum going at all. And they've been the second easiest team to punish from turnover since round 11. So always got to quote it, only West Coast has been easier to punish from turnover since round 11 than Collingwood, which is just, as I said, unheard of. Just no skill, no ability to sort of protect the turnover and no pressure. They've just been a fair bit off in the last 5 or 6 weeks.
If not for that, the comeback of all comebacks against North that we spoke about before briefly, they would be 12th and only percentage ahead of Hawthorn 13th. Now, it may turn out to be a very, very important win, but it also is an indicator they probably shouldn't have won that game. And if they didn't win that game, would we look at them and say that there's no way that they can win the premiership this year?
Well, do you say it now? Because I'm definitely not.
No,
I'm definitely not ready to sit here and say they can't win it.
No,
I could still tip them. I could still tip them to win it.
Is also, these are stats, and then you look at their forward line; it's decimated.
Yep.
They're not getting Dan McStay back maybe for another month or so, maybe if they're fortunate.
So
Jamie Elliott may return, but
so number 1 forward 50 ground ball gets. So they've made that work. I think we spoke about last week. They're the only team where the forwards actually win more ground balls.
It is, but I'm
just not writing them off. I don't think they're clearly not in a great position like they were last year.
The reality is they're ninth.
I just think I look at
right in the middle of it.
Yeah, look at what they did last year. The personnel, And
they had that
think
little
they can
slump
get
before
themselves back.
finals last year and were able to turn it around. But some of these numbers are damning. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. That's for sure.